So welcome everybody. Is this working? My name is Steve Anderson. I teach here in the Interactive Media Division of the School of Cinematic Arts, and I also direct a new PhD program called Media Arts and Practice. And it's been my pleasure for the past several months to work with Mimi Ito on the this event that we call 24/7 a DIY Video Summit. I'm mostly here to introduce the Dean of the School of Cinematic Arts, Elizabeth Daly, but I also wanted to, while I have you all here, to just say a few words about the summit, because I can. Historically, academia has shown itself to be, I think, pretty bad at trying to stay hip with what's going down outside the walls of campuses like this. And so it's a slightly audacious, if not to say, I hope not to say, reckless aspiration of this summit that we would aim to shift the balance of our traditional role as observers to that of participants, and to really try to facilitate conversations and connections among the various DIY communities and observers that we've invited here today. So we also wanted to create an opportunity to invite ourselves and you to stop and look around carefully at the incredible range of things that are happening in this emergent culture of do-it-yourself, not just in terms of the focus of this festival, which is DIY video, but also a broader spectrum of DIY practices. And there have been any number of people who have made this event possible on a practical level. But from the beginning, and I would say going back to the days of the Network Publics Research Group at Annenberg Center for Communication in 2005, 2006, there's really one person whose, I think, insight and really kind of omniscient consciousness was what made this event possible and really has sustained it throughout, and that's Mimi Ito. So with that, I want to say thanks very much to our amazingly distinguished panel of plenary speakers, and I'd like to introduce to you the Dean of the School of Cinematic Arts, Elizabeth Daly.
Whoops, okay. All right, how's that? I think it's fine. Thanks, Steve. It's really wonderful to have all of you here today, and we're particularly proud that this is under the auspices of the Institute for Multimedia Literacy, which is now part of the School of Cinematic Arts, and we're delighted about that. I particularly want to thank the organizers of the event, Mimi and Steve. Steve thanked Mimi. I get the pleasure of thanking Steve, who I know how much time, energy, effort, and thought has gone into this. And there's an incredible DIY organizing committee, as well as always here, its staff support that makes everything possible. When people think about USC and cinema, and now the School of Cinematic Arts as we're called, I guess the first thing that always comes to mind is George Lucas, Robert Zemeckis, Steven Spielberg, and the other really stellar professional media names. They designate our buildings here on campus and no doubt represent the pinnacle of professional media. However, what DIY represents for us is a cultural change, and one that takes the visual language of film that has been so much a part of our world in cinematic arts and sends it outward to new makers, new audiences, to amateur creators who now have their own ability to make, share, and watch their own work on their terms. And from the point of view of the school, it also helps us within the university to say, we're not a boutique. We're really critical to the knowledge of the 21st century. While we will always respect and admire the work of our professional filmmakers, and that finally is one of the great missions of the school, is to train those people for the next generation. This weekend's screenings, discussions, and workshops, I think, prove that we must also reckon with the power and the potential, the incredible potential, of do-it-yourself makers. This is something we've thought about in the school, well, for over a decade since we first started the Institute for Multimedia Literacy. We've tried to address the fact that the whole nature of literacy was changing, and that one of the basic literacies for new generations was an aptitude with cinematic language. Now that we're seeing this visual literacy and culture take shape, though, I think we face another set of challenges. What will be the future of this kind of media production? How are we responsible for encouraging it? How are we going to do that? And how are we going to make sure that it propels us forward into new ways of thinking and interacting as communities? We at USC, I think especially in the School of Cinema, are in a position of abundance. how do we make sure that everyone has the opportunity to explore the potential of DIY media? And there's so many more questions that grow from that one, and that's what we hope our panel will start to address today. But before I turn things over to the panel, I want to say a big thank you to the key sponsors of this event. The first funding actually came from the Annenberg Center for Communication, and the MacArthur Foundation has been instrumental, as have the folks at the Visions and Voices initiative here on campus. And finally, thank you to our technology sponsors, DIVX and Garage Cube, who sponsor the reception that you're going to get to enjoy in the courtyard tonight. So welcome. We're delighted to have you here. I hope we're going to see all of you here a lot as we go forward trying to address these questions, which will, I think, occupy us for many years. And now let me turn this back over to the real visionary behind it, Mimi Ito.
So without further ado, I do want to turn to our plenary panel, and I'm sort of personally really delighted to have these 5 folks on the stage, which I kind of think of as sort of the superheroes of the digital culture revolution. And I think I'm allowed to say that, even though one of them is my brother, but anyway. So I wanted to introduce Howard because he is moderating, and I don't think Howard really requires any introduction, but he did ask me to mention that, you know, he kind of considers himself a habitual outlier and that he might consider that his new title going forward. So Howard, it's all yours. And I will have a roving mic. We want to keep this session fairly interactive, so you can either come up here to the podium if you have a comment or want to get in on the conversation, or we'll pass the mic around.
I'm quite sure that everybody here knows who all these people are and what they've done. In which case, it's just amazing to be in the same room and for me to be on the same panel with these people. If you did wander in here from another planet and you wonder who these people are, well, first of all, welcome to planet Earth. And secondly, we have something here called a search engine. Look up their names and you'll see what I'm talking about. So I'm going to briefly introduce them and frame the discussion and ask a few questions to get things rolling. And I'd like to make this as inclusive as possible. I'd like to, and I'm sure all of us would like to hear what each of the panelists have to say about the question, but then before we move on to another question, let's see what else people here have to say, because after all, a lot of what this is about dissolving that barrier between the performer and the audience and the people on stage and the people sitting in the seats watching us. When I asked them about an hour ago to describe themselves quite spontaneously, without really any kind of contemplation, the folks you see before you describe themselves as harmless, undisciplined, and confusing. Henry Jenkins, and I quote, likes to pass himself off as mostly harmless.
But we know better.
Joey Ito, internet poster boy. John Seeley Brown, known widely as JSB, is chief of confusion, which is on his website, so it must be true. And Yochai Benkler, and I quote again, people think it's multidisciplinary, but I'm really undisciplined. I just personally want to say that each one of these people has had a extraordinary guiding influence on my life, whether they've known it or not. So just not in chronological order, but starting here. I've been asked and have asked myself throughout my career, are these things that I'm enmeshed in and have written about, the personal computer, the use of the internet for social communication, the way we're using mobile devices, is this good for us or not? And I've come to the conclusion that the answer is it depends on what people know and what they do with what they know. And the more I thought about that, and when I began engaging with students, I realized that that's a matter of literacy. And when I began looking around for someone who had some place for me to stand, to start looking around at what literacies in participatory media meant, Henry Jenkins really stood out and continues to stand out as a beacon in that regard. Joey Ito came by, and I think on the first generation of Mac laptops, sometime, I think late in 1993 or early in 1994, showed me his website. He had created his own site on the World Wide Web, and I thought, I want one of those, and I've been sucked into it ever since, as I'm sure everybody else here has experienced. I interviewed JSB about 10 years ago about the fact that at what was Xerox PARC at that time, he was chief scientist, was beginning to use social scientists to try to look at how people use technology. What a radical idea. Isn't it strange that 10 years have passed and so few social scientists are actually employed doing that? I found my way there when I looked for something better than a typewriter, and ended up commuting 45 minutes to PARC in order to write with the marvelous machines they had there back then, and immediately recognized that these are not just better typewriters, but mind amplifiers. And it's astonishing to me today. It's as if you started out with a Christopher Columbus era sailing ship and lived long enough to have 747s during that period of time, since the Alto and the iPhone. Just the sheer power of mental power and social power that these devices have opened are astonishing to me. And when I started trying to put together how it is that people are using devices to not only communicate with each other, but to do things together, to organize what I discovered social scientists to call collective action, I just had a very strong gut feeling that something very important is happening here. It's happening in terms of governance, it's happening in terms of economics, it's happening in terms of cultural production. And again, Yochai Benkler really was and is a beacon in showing that we're really at the beginning of something, and that we should look with a very broader perspective at what's happening. What's happening today is just the beginning of what's going to be happening for the next 500 years, perhaps. So when I started thinking about literacies, now here comes the part where I'm going to frame this and we're going to get on to the questions. We concentrate an awful lot on technologies. There are times when technologies enable people to communicate in new ways, in ways that they weren't able to communicate before. And quite often when that happens, the literacy that spreads enables people to invent things that the inventors of the technologies certainly didn't have in mind, and they invent ways of doing things together. So I think, collective action is the fancy word for that. They create institutions, and institutions not so much in terms of buildings with names on them, but codified ways of doing things together in ways that were better than what we were able to do individually or what we were able to do together before. So, for example, we are really living in the age of institutions that people created in the wake of Gutenberg literacy, democracy, or at least the idea that citizens can govern themselves rather than being subjects of monarchs, science as collective knowledge-gathering enterprise rather than something that some genius comes up with now and again. Cultural production, and of course that brings us to the center of what we're talking about here. We're really seeing a revolutionary change in the means of production and distribution of culture. All of these institutions are up for change, and as JSB pointed out at lunch, the way in which that change goes is quite often influenced by very strong gravitational pull of incumbent institutions. There's a path dependency. So to me, the most important question when I heard that these people would be here was the activist question, which is how should we think about what to do to influence the way the institutions of democratic governance, of cultural production, of knowledge gathering are going to be taking shape in the future. I believe it's magical thinking to believe that because the access to production and distribution is democratized, that what will emerge will necessarily be democratic. And I'm excited by the fact that the outcome is not decided yet, and we have something to do with it. So the first question I have for the panel, and we'll start with Henry here, is what is your best vision of the best scenario by which we might be able to influence the outcome?
Okay. So I think the first response I'd say is to recognize that what we're calling do-it-yourself media has a much longer history than the history of YouTube. And that what we have to do is go back to that history and understand the ideals that motivated it when people were producing and distributing media when it was difficult, and understand what it means to do it in a context where distribution systems become much easier. So for me, I'd want to go back to the mid-19th century when kids were using toy printing presses to produce what we now call zines and distributing them on a national circuit, the beginning of the Amateur Press Association. I want to go to the amateur radio participants and the teens. I'd want to go to the early science fiction fans of the 1920s. I'd want to look at African-American filmmakers responding to Birth of a Nation by insisting on their power to take cameras and make their own movies that dealt with race in different ways and circulated within their own communities. I'd want to think about the women who put two VCRs and patch cords together and edited their own videos 30 years ago, well before the dawn of YouTube. And I'd want to think about what all of those people and many, many more were involved in fighting for, what their vision of society looks like. You know, Patty Zimmerman writes in her book, Real Cinema, about the history of home movies, and a number of advocates along the way who envisioned amateur cinema as something that would be transformative of the society, in part because it would bring about diversity. It would ensure that every voice in the society could be heard and taken seriously as part of a larger public sphere or a larger sort of marketplace of ideas. And her point was that again and again in the history, the home movie became the way we talked about this because it was stuck in the home. There was no system of distribution which allowed this stuff to move forward into the larger society. So if I think about my vision for the future, it would be one where everyone had the power to participate, and where everyone had, and where diversity was valued as central to the enterprise. So it's not a we will build and they will come. It's not that we construct YouTube and we automatically get democracy, right? There's still a struggle to be fought around democracy, and it's a struggle in terms of education, in terms of teaching media literacy skills to kids. It's a struggle in terms of law, in terms of changing the notion of fair use so we have strong protection on our ability to respond to those stories that are absolutely central to our culture. It involves changing politics, how we mobilize people who are feeling empowered by making videos and turn them loose in the streets to transform society, as we saw in the media movements of the 80s and from the 90s forward. It's about making those connections between communities that are all right now separate so that they actually listen to and learn from each other. And it's ensuring that we have a technical infrastructure which allows nonprofit production and distribution as media as well as commercially based. And it ensures that majoritarian principles don't drown out the voices of the minority. So if I make a statement about what my ideals are, that's the heart of what I think we're trying to build, and we're not there yet. We have a lot, we can see the potential now so vividly we can taste it. But the fight now begins to move beyond technical issues, or to fight the technical issues through a lens of social and cultural change, and to ensure that we reach the point where we can all be heard.
Joy?
So I think about some of the really big problems that we have right now, like take the environment, for instance. And I think that basically, if we try to do everything top down, it's going to be too little too late. There are a lot of economic interests that corrupt the system, and there are political interests that corrupt the system. And basically, my feeling is whether it's the political problems, geopolitical problems that we have, whether it's the global warming issues, even preparation for the pandemic, possibility of a pandemic, these all have, these are not top-down. It's too complex, and there's too much corruption just based on power for it to happen top-down. That's just sort of a belief that I have. And I also believe that human beings have a very strong natural survival instinct that can kick in when they become aware. I also believe that as we enter this new period, revolution is not about force, it's about information. And whether you look at the terrorists or whatever is going on, it's more about voice and less about force, and even more about voice and less about votes. I think that the voice, and so we have an organization, I'm on the board of David's here, Global Voices. I think the point of Global Voices is that by providing everybody with a voice, that's the most powerful thing that we can do to try to create a grassroots movement. And I think that the grassroots movement and this kind of triggering an awareness and a natural survival instinct is how we're going to make change. But I also think that you can't, when we think about media, there's the politics of it, there's the economics of it, and there's the entertainment of it. And they all connect, and they all play off of each other. You can't look at these pieces in isolation. And actually, I was looking for a reference, and if somebody can help me find it, that'd be great, because I heard somebody quote Napoleon, but I couldn't find the actual quote. But somebody quoted Napoleon saying that I would rather control the country's songs, write the country's songs, than write the country's laws. Okay? And whether he said it or not, I think it makes a lot of sense, which is basically, when you change a country, you change it by changing the hearts and minds of the people through the culture, not by writing a bunch of laws. And similarly, I think what we have to understand is that the way that we wake up people and provide them with voice and give them incentive to do voice, it has to be economically and technically feasible, but it has to be part of the culture. And so, and if you look at Stuart Brand's diary at Stanford about his activism, half the book's about girls and drugs, and it's all one thing. And a lot of times we sit around, we talk about these components, but they're all related. And I think that's why it's great here, because we're talking about all these pieces kind of together, and I think the way they influence. And I think it's important to realize that while we participate because we enjoy it, there's also an economic element and all that. So I feel very confident that while in the short term we may not have the right enough activism, and we may not be aware, and we may not be fighting for the right things, that at some point there's a kind of a trigger that gets pulled when we say, hey, wait a second, we're about to lose this, something like what's happening with the global warming issue. And I feel like I fight for the open internet, and I want to make sure that the mobile internet ends up being as open as the open internet, and that we don't also give up things like anonymity and free speech because we're only looking at America. I think that this is a very important global issue, and I don't think it's just as simple as democracy. I think it's much bigger. I think it's about global voices and a competition of ideas and dialogue and caring and things like that. I mean, I think that you can have a democracy, but if you don't care about other people in other countries, it doesn't matter. And caring comes from culture. It doesn't come from economics, and it doesn't come just from politics.
Go ahead, try to follow that one. So let me put a small couple twists on this. I tend to think very carefully, or not carefully, I never do anything carefully, but think a lot about the social life around objects, the social life around information, the social life around different types of objects. I think as we look at this movement we're talking about right now, we talked about this a bit yesterday. You look at a YouTube clip or something like this, you think of that potentially as an object, but what really makes that object gain signification is its life, how basically that travels through social spaces, being passed on by RSS feeds, digs feeds, all these kinds of things. And so I think we have to kind of understand that the things we create actually have a very rich social life. Just in understanding how to amplify that and understand the consequences of that are, first of all, important. We also talked about at lunch, take that seriously. It's ironic to I think all of us, if you step back from it, that this is called DIY, do it yourself. But everyone here, as we talked about at lunch, kind of recognized that it should be maybe DIT, or do it through others, or do it with us, whatever favorite way you want to do it. But I mean, this is a group phenomenon, and that is key to understanding how this becomes a fundamentally collaborative frameworks that each of us is kind of engaging as a part of. This comes back then to, I think, the importance of then looking at the bigger issue of what might be the social goods that are being produced with this in order to kind of facilitate a richer understanding of the movements at stake here. And to me, building a little bit on what you were saying, Joey, think about it a moment. This may turn out to be a phenomenal platform, a phenomenal media, in order to facilitate much richer cross-cultural understanding. We do not understand each other in this world very well. We do not understand each other's cultures, each other's governments, each other's laws, by the way, and so on and so forth. And how is it that maybe this media could really accelerate through kind of almost collaborative co-construction? You know, videos about our own cultures done, collectively. And in fact, it's very kind of interesting to me if you look at, go back to like World of Warcraft, where the action is in World of Warcraft is the social life around the edge of that game, is in the guilds. Well, look at what happens if in that guild you actually have people from multiple cultures. Within probably 2 or 3 weeks, you suddenly form your own ensemble that opens up a kind of communication that is just truly transformational of how we look at each other in that guild or in that raid and so on and so forth. So I think that notion of how to bring that social life to the fore, I think is going to be very, very important. I think that, and this would be a little bit of a lead into Yochai, although I never can predict, but we can talk about, Elizabeth, as you did, the literacy of multimedia. What Doug Thomas and I are looking at now is maybe what's the literacy of change? Because we're really at the moment of all kinds of change. And this brings us back to the notion of institutions, both kind of formal, informal, et cetera, and kind of how basically agency is enabled through institutions. And we have to kind of understand what are the institutional structures that we want ourselves to have in order to kind of afford the kinds of impact that we want. And there's a lot to be said about that. I come from a realm of Silicon Valley of all kinds of innovations. But you walk into any lab that does innovation and you say, well, I need to innovate in a new kind of institution. They do look at you as if you dropped in from Mars. The idea of innovation applying to institutions, until I met you, you're the first person I've run into that said, oh, well, of course, John, but nobody in Silicon Valley would say that. And the last comment, it's hard to kind of understand this, but this movement started, the internet in particular started, but a lot of even the video stuff started, where we've now had a multiplicative impact of maybe 10 to the 4th, 10 to the 5th types of increase in power. The architectures underlying the way we connect to each other, the way we transmit, the way we build tools, was built in an era in which power was scarce. I like to walk into my network folks at telephone companies and say, suppose my cell phone has a terabyte of memory. How can that become, we now think about trickle charging the power into our cell phone. What about trickle powering information into our cell phone at the same time? You would build the architecture of the networks completely differently. And in fact, the whole notion of openness might actually start to change. So I'm really saying that when you have enough power, we got to then go back and kind of recognize how we have built certain properties into our architectures that really don't understand what is so possible to do today.
So my role is rinse and repeat. You asked us about best case scenario, not realistic assessments. You asked us for a little moment of utopianism, so I'll play with that a little bit. In the best case scenario, I think a deep change in two things. One is a sense of personal efficacy and the way in which people understand themselves as capable of doing in the world alone and in loose association with others, as opposed to railing against a world that won't move. I think very much of a very long period, and in some senses perhaps most powerfully in the last century or two, has been the rationalization and generalization of systems of control throughout society. Technical, organizational, legal, bureaucratic and administrative, understood as ways of improving material welfare and the effectiveness of large collectives through the muting of human agency, through the structuring and harnessing of human action into well-designed and predictably, collectively effective outcomes. That's Fordism, that's major technical systems like the AT&T system, that's obviously the rise of the administrative state in both its benign and malign versions in mid-century. I hope that the practice of being able to speak in ways that used to be received, an encyclopedia used to be something you got from experts and was remote and was fixed, and both what was allowed to be in it and the way in which you got it, we, the vast majority of people, were disabled from participating in it. So hopefully, the radical distribution of the core capacities, the physical capacities and the cultural and mental capacities in the population, together with new practices of loose social collaboration, allow us through the experience of first of small scale and later on of larger scale effective action to begin to believe that it's actually feasible to do things, that there's a certain set of approaches that can actually achieve things, and move from something that's always there on the periphery as a countercultural, as a radical political movement, something that's practiced at the level of we can do something. In some senses, the banal version of this is the small dog owners meetup group that goes out and creates dog runs, and at a much more foundational level, it's suddenly the ability of groups from all over the world, like the Revolutionary Association for Women in Afghanistan, to have counter media to counter the idea that in fact there's that much of a difference from the perspective of women between Taliban and the Mujahideen. So that's at a very broad level of abstraction. I think at a practical level, what it means for video is that we begin to move from a concept where we teach textual literacy and we expect as a minimal requirement of competence in society to be able to communicate in writing without expecting that everyone will be a Tolstoy or a Hemingway. But we don't have anything remotely like that for the ability to communicate visually in video, in rich media. And so in addition to the technical capabilities, the beginning of the experimentation and the learning so that people actually can, layered over with exactly these kinds of new social practices of understanding that I don't need an existing unit of people, the union, the classroom, the party, in order to bring together people in loose association focused on a subject, because we need to do it together. We can pull together, as you said, a particular collective of people, wherever they happen to be, who care about, whom we care about. The blockages between here and there are enormous. Partly they're about belief and about skepticism, but partly they're about very real conflict. I mean, there is a large number of existing historical technical architectures. There are very strong economic divergences between groups that want to control a certain set of platforms and groups that are business groups that want to open it. And setting the alliances across commercial and non-commercial, across public and private, becomes very, very important in order to set these systems, to build openness into the technical systems, to build openness into our systems of accreditation of what counts as good and not good, as worthy and not worthy, and to push back on some of the efforts to close down networks to make them more efficient rather than continuously more productive and generative, to close down on social networks so that they are not endangering a particular relationship of authority, say between teachers and students. I have all these colleagues who tell people to shut down their laptops because they don't want to compete for attention and power in the classroom. But I think that's just a very small classroom metaphor for a much wider phenomenon. And so that's both my best case scenario and the very large barriers I see between us and there.
All right, before we pontificate more, let's participate. So, do we have microphones? Okay, wait until the microphone. We've got someone here in the fourth row. Who's got a hand raised.
It's Lev Manovich.
Well, it was fantastic, and of course, I'm going to say something nasty and dark, so I will not disappoint you. So I'm going to say these things not because I believe in them, but just to bring a very different perspective, right? Maybe to make it a more complex conversation. So I'm going to ask like 3 hypothetical questions. And of course, I do realize that the range of culture and media called today DIY or social media user-generated content is so wide that it's impossible to make generalizations about it. So the things which I'm going to ask obviously apply more to certain parts of it than others, right? We don't apply to projects such as Remix America, but maybe we apply more to things like anime music videos. So question number 1, Patricia Zimmerman, who was first to write about amateur film, has shown convincingly that the whole amateur film market was created from above by Kodak. They created a special format, 60mm, we created this culture. So my 3 questions are, number 1, to what extent, let's say, DIY video or larger phenomenon of user-generated content, is driven from above by consumer electronics industry, because after all, spending on consumer electronics is now number 1 category in terms of lifestyle purchases around the world. Number 2, to what extent this phenomenon is being driven by social media sites, who after all make money from advertising and they want to have as many users as possible. And then a provocative question number 3, to what extent what we're dealing with is not liberation from culture industry, but a kind of culture industry 2.0, where people are not simply being exposed to certain template-driven media products, but in fact we're now simulating them, emulating them themselves, so we're now themselves making media, so we can say that perhaps the kind of culture industry has taken over people imaginary in a new way. So this is just 3 hypothetical questions. And again, that doesn't mean I believe in any of them, but just to kind of bring something else to the conversation.
That sounds like a Henry Jenkins question to me.
Well, I'll get us started, and while people warm up, I guess I'm sort of reminded of the classic definition of leadership, which is that someone figures out which direction the mob is moving, run around in front of it, and says, "Follow me." That yes, that there are companies that are making money off of user-generated content in a variety of ways for a variety of reasons, and have economic interest to get out of the way or enable certain activities and to close other activities down. And we should look at it very critically. But to my mind, to assume that the camera makers or the platform owners created this is about like assuming the guy who sells the picks and shovels in Alaska started the gold rush. That is, they're making money off of it. They're maybe structure who has access to the tools of production, but the gold rush started much longer. And that's why I began with that litany of the history of do-it-yourself media, which has been building momentum over a long period of time. My sense is the industry often acts as if it invents communities. We talk about the Saturn community or the Apple community. And in fact, most of the communities it's dealing with are communities that have a much larger history with their own agendas, their own politics, their own taste, their own hierarchies, their own leadership that we have to negotiate with. And we have to, cope and we have to court if you're thinking about the corporate side of things. So I don't buy the scenario that this stuff was caused by companies trying to sell products. I see companies selling products because they're people eager to participate. I see the companies maybe getting in the way through various economic relationships that take place between grassroots creators and I've talked a lot lately about the gap between the gift economy of participatory culture and the commodity culture of user-generated content, and the ways those two things are at conflict with each other. And what I see as I look around all the communities that are here is that each of them at the moment are in a conflict with the people who want to turn them into commodities in one way or another. And groups that may have started just because it's fun to make fan vids are becoming angrier and angrier at some of the economic systems and the intellectual property systems because they're being used in ways that commodify what they chose to do for fun, what they chose to do to share with each other. And so I think I get cause and effect different. I see cause and effect differently than the proposition you just laid out.
I would only push back not in taking your question or your critique as a caution against a deterministic view of this going, rather than as, or rather one could read it in two ways. Option one, the market corrupts. The market always corrupts. The market is ultimately more powerful and historically will always corrupt. Settle down, stop getting so excited. Option two, the market corrupts. The market doesn't corrupt absolutely, and one can play in power in all sorts of directions. And so the prototypical capitalist organization is the printer. Now, that is one of the very first genuinely capitalist structures. And yet, after the Council of Trent, the hit list is the index of prohibited life. Where would we be without that? And yet, where would we be without the capitalist print? The flip side is what drives amateur radio in the teens and later on 21, 22, 23, maybe even 24 to 26 is very much an amateur drive, driven in many cases by people who were trained in the army to go use radio for World War I, but then gets subverted with the combination of the regulatory decisions about where to clear spectrum and the RCA, AT&T, Westinghouse, GE patent pool monopoly crowding out all of the small bubbling things. These are two stories, one which fits your story, the other which I think is the opposite, that strikes me as taking your critique more as a basis to be aware and to focus energies on navigating the relationship between the market and the non-market and the state, rather than as a depressive view of where things will grow.
I'd like to add, not just to be a devil's advocate here, but the more I've tried to scratch at these questions myself, the more I've come to question my own ideological assumptions. And as Professor Benkler's pointed out, the role of early printers in capitalism, trying to look back at some of the ideas, and when I say democracy, I understand that that's quite an American-centric idea, but I think that people around the world would agree that there's an essential difference between a government which affects your life, which has some degree of transparency, and one which doesn't have to tell anybody why it makes its decisions, and a form of governance that has power over our lives, which can be influenced by what I think and what you think, and how our opinion bubbles up into what's called public opinion, and one that is impervious to such influence. And of course, that kind of evolution certainly is not at its end. But looking into those origins, I found a historian by the name of David Zaret, who wrote a very interesting book about the origins of the public sphere. And in essence, he said if the petitioners during the English Civil War, who suddenly found that they had a voice for their particular sect, and the printers who were looking for new markets were told that someday it would not be a hanging offense to reveal what happened in Parliament, and that someday the opinion of these people with their little petitions would influence people who made the laws that governed their lives. They would not only be disbelieving, but they would probably be shocked and appalled and want you to be hung. That what happened was an evolution that had a co-evolution that had a lot of motives involved, and never discount the power of the commercial motive to drive things. I think what's interesting is the way in which time and again, particularly when you're talking about communication technologies, the inventors and the incumbents have very strong agendas, and if there is a way that people can appropriate those technologies to do things that they need, those agendas can quite often be swept aside. Their power and their desire to regain that power is not going to go away, but it's not a static thing. I think we're talking about a co-evolution here between the vernaculars that emerge when people have the power to communicate, and the kinds of institutions, not only governmental institutions, but cultural institutions that they evolve. I see JSB nodding there. Did you have anything to add to that?
To me, it's an interesting issue. If you really look, in the past, we had regulations in public goods for a purpose, in order to kind of figure out how to avoid tragedy of the commons, to divide things up. You know, it's very interesting to me that in the new kind of bottom-up thinking that we're kind of theorizing today, the ability to mobilize intrinsic motivation in the economics, or the kind of theories of how intrinsic motivation now have to be brought to the fore to understand how do they really interface with extrinsic motivation, which in the past has driven stuff down from the top. That interface is getting incredibly complicated, over kind of richly complicated, because now we can do so many things that actually, in a very curious way, avoid the need for regulation in an awful lot of public goods. And this is, again, a brand new world. I mean, if you really think about, as your favorite topic, open spectrum, we can approach that in ways today that, in some sense, the more the merrier, through kind of a completely different type of network protocol. And so, I think this whole way to unleash intrinsic motivation and to avoid the need for some of the forms of regulation we've kind of bought into, is a backdrop to some of these issues.
Yeah, Edith from the Worldwide Workshop. All of you commented on the importance of this new thing, that we can collaborate, co-produce in a community, and how empowering that is. All the way to the point that John said that you reflected during lunch about maybe it shouldn't be DIY, but maybe DIT, like doing it together. But I actually would like to ask a question about this, especially if we talk about digital epistemology, John, because for example, Picasso and Braque invented cubism by meeting every day at each other's studios, or sitting in a cafe with some friends. But at the end, they each went to their own canvas, and they expressed it very differently in their way. And there was something very important about the construction of cubism in each one of them. Things that were similar, things that were the same. Picasso maybe generated 30 pieces when Braque was very multi-layered. And everybody that read a little bit about that invention understand that and how it worked in the community. In the 80s, when computers were expensive and bulky, and people start using them, like one computer in a classroom or one computer in a school, a lot of people came up with ideas of collaborative learning and how important it. But I don't think we're talking about that here. I think the fact that there are cameras on cell phones, the fact that computers are cheaper, is allowing people to do both. So it's not just about doing it together and co-producing. If we are really thinking about construction of knowledge in these communities, and really people learning as they produce all these things, which is an important aspect, we want to also create tools and platform, and also ensure that the technology is cheap enough so everybody can have it and express it, that everybody learns how to do it. So maybe it's not about DIT, but maybe YID, which means you do it. That's what's important, that you do, that you participate, that it's you really learn by doing. And it's not just about yourself. You can do it yourself, you can do it with others, but the fact that you do it, I think that's maybe the most important thing. Maybe you can comment on that, the YID concept.
I don't know, can I take Mike Owner's prerogative to build on that point?
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, on the vision question, one of the things that I wanted to throw in there was just exactly this issue of common culture. And I think this work is so important just because this is what's at stake, right? The future of our common culture. And we've been living through an era until fairly recently where there was a fairly wide gulf between professional media creation, which got a certain kind of circulation, and everyday creation, which also got a lot of circulation, and it has always been where most knowledge and culture gets produced, right? I mean, that's incredibly important to remember, that us doing it, we've always done it. It's just never circulated in the same world as professional media creation. So what's at stake is everything in the middle. And how is it that the stuff we create is playing with the stuff they've been creating, if we put it in those adversarial terms? But I don't think it necessarily has to be adversarial. But I think that's why the stakes are very high and how that relationship gets reconfigured, because what we're deciding now is what we're going to be living with that for a hell of a long time. I mean, I feel like we're in a transitional moment where these binaries are being disrupted about what counts as common culture, our common language. And in fact, there are a lot of scary things that can happen. I mean, on one side, you know, there's those of us who are very happy about this resurgence of amateur culture and the visibility in common culture. And there's a lot of people who are very scared that this is about fragmentation and nobody knows what's credible news anymore. You know, all these bloggers out there saying whatever they want when, you know, legitimate news outlets aren't getting their play. I mean, there's a lot of different voices at stake in this space. And, you know, personally, my vision is one where we can find some respectful relationship between the amateur and the commercial space, between these different forms of us making it, because everybody is making stuff. We just do that. Like us talking, you talking to your colleague at the water cooler is creating culture. It's just the question of the genres that are going to stabilize over time and who is allowed to use what kind of material in new ways. And all of these things are being renegotiated, and I feel like a tremendous amount of time is being paid on some of the legal dimensions of this, which are very important, but a lot more discourse has to happen for all of us who are creating it. And what does this mean? You know, this video of, you know, a kid in high school that he shot of his teacher yelling at him. What does that mean when that's circulating on YouTube? And what are the kinds of norms, genres, ways of practicing common culture that we need to start developing? What are the best practices? What do we think is right? What deserves to be celebrated? And you know, how does fame, reputation, authenticity work in these spaces?
I'm sorry, can I, do you
Go
mind?
ahead.
One of the things I think that's important to remember, I was in a discussion with a mainstream media editor and asked them why they didn't cover Africa more. And said, because people don't care. It doesn't increase circulation with it's balanced, right? So there's a systemic bias of media to reinforce those things that we already care about and not to push, except in exceptions, things that we don't care about. And one of the problems with the YouTubes of the world and things like that is that in many ways, even though there's a shift, we still talk about high school, we still talk about, you know, it's still reinforcing certain systemic biases, and it doesn't solve the caring problem that I was talking about. And one of the things that's interesting about World of Warcraft, my guild, this morning I was logged in and we had a soldier that had just come back from Afghanistan talking to a teenager, talking to a Chinese kid, talking to a priest. And they're bonded and they care now about things that they would never have cared about. And so the community aspect of this, the social aspect of this global network of global voices is really, really important because it bridges the caring problem that can counter the systemic bias. And this global voices about having the video also increases the ability for us to care. So for instance, when we're trying to get video footage out of Burma or video footage out of Sierra Leone of the child soldier issue, it reinforces an ability for us to make the caring problem happen. And from regions that you know mainstream media wouldn't even send a reporter to cover. And so to me, one of the things that's important, I think, about what Mimi's talking about, in a way is really is key. Is I think that the mainstream media has, because of its sort of focus on the economics of the whole thing, has had a very high head and has sort of thrown away a lot of the diversity in our culture. And so when I think about taking back the commons, I think about taking back a certain level of diversity, and then some of these groups that Henry's been talking about. I mean, you doing it yourself is fine, but I don't think it becomes part of the culture unless those values are shared with others. And to find those people, I think, is really important. And I don't think that necessarily the way that the business, even on the internet, is constructed today is really helping to go against the systemic bias.
Enjoy just a small comment that it could be somewhat you said could be misunderstood in the sense that it's not just the conversations that happened in your guild this morning,
Right.
because that is around action. And so what got me so interested in DIY is it is also the doing of stuff and the joint doing of stuff. So you can have conversations around that joint doing, but without the joint doing, the conversations can just fly by each other. Mm-hmm. So there's something that's great about the way that stuff gets grounded out in action.
I want to push back, not push back, but just use both of these to focus on what I see as changes or mistakes or whatever you want to call them that really have roots in the 19th century but throughout the 20th primarily. The first is treating collective and individual as an oppositional binary. I think is very much an outcome of 19th century collectivist ideology, the battles. So you have communitarians coming up in the 80s trying to come up with something that nonetheless has a very strong emphasis on locating the individual in the community as opposed to in the constant tension between the two. And I think actually one of the things that you do see and that we do see and that we'll begin to learn is exactly the fact that collaboration and cooperation are not the opposite of individualism. And these are not a binary, but rather are complementary. And we can't really be well-functioning individuals without a certain cooperative and social dynamic. And we can't really be an attractive cooperative dynamic without a recursion back and forth to we'll talk together and then each one of us will express ourselves separately. And I think that's going to be one of my utopian things that we'll learn how to do. The second, Mimi, I'd like to push back just a little bit on the question, on the idea that what we've always been doing and now it's just a question of how we access it. I suspect that the period, particularly of the 20th century with the industrialization of cultural production, of mass cultural production, but not only, also actually rationalization generally. So knowledge about healing used to be widely distributed, got semi-scientificized with a lot of quacks and some people who were more, and then got rationalized and professionalized and expertise oriented to the point that the culture of healing that was much more folk and driven as do-it-yourself was very much shunted to the side, disvalued, sometimes even made illegal. I think similarly in the space of narrative, sitting around telling stories, maybe playing music and singing, was actually a set of cultural forms that was very much suppressed, though not eliminated, by mass media. So that even though when you study fan cultures, you certainly see peripheries that are enormously productive in conversation, creative in conversation with this, you nonetheless see large swaths of people who just sit in front of a screen next to each other and begin to understand attractive culture as only that which comes from the authority, just like you understand medicine as only that which comes from the licensed professional. And part of the idea of learning new efficacy and agency is to recapture the sense that it's valuable and then to relearn it.
Yeah,
So
no,
just the question of recapturing is also a question to understand how to work against the inherent path dependencies that live in our norms, or our mores, in our legal system.
Well, I'd like to pull this back to a conversation that Alex Juhas initiated for us in the very first panel, where she was contrasting the notion of do-it-yourself as a critical practice aimed at corporate media and do-it-yourself as the everyday practices, the mundane practices of everyday life. And I've struggled with that dichotomy that she set up, especially thinking about it in relation to the old feminist slogan, the personal is the political, and the degree to which people, women gathering in living rooms, sharing their personal experience, became the beginnings of a consciousness-raising effort. And it seems to me we have to recognize the value of the individual in the context of this and what individual experience brought public means for the people involved. And I'll go back to the video Mimi alluded to a little bit just now. One of the videos showed a high school kid who'd been flashing his camera in the cafeteria and who stayed on as the teacher chewed him out down the hall and took him to the principal's office, and the principal began to berate him. And the act of making that public was very powerful to me. It brought me back to the dynamics of power of what it is to be young in American society. And we could read it on one level as pretty trivial personal stuff. Here's a kid misbehaved, and he either got treated fairly or unjustly by the school. But the fact that the school's power was exercised by removing him from a public space, moving him into private, and that their control over the communication environment was part of how they controlled and regulated his behavior. And that being able to take that and then make it public again is a very important statement that's enabled by access to this camera. We could read that as individual. He may not have had much of a community behind him except the cheering kids in the cafeteria. But we can see it as an important political act. And so it's hard to decide externally what's trivial or what's mundane about the practices of everyday life. The second point is to build on what it is to do it. Because this is tied to a film festival, do it keeps getting defined as producing video. Well, to my mind, what's important about YouTube as much as producing video is the role of everyday people in curating and circulating and archiving video. We could think about the Hillary Clinton weeping moment in New Hampshire, which people have said transformed the race, at least in New Hampshire primary. Most people didn't see that on television news. A large number of them saw it because it was archived illegally on YouTube. We think about the Colbert White House Correspondents' Dinner. We think about the Keith Olbermann moments that began to generate attention to Olbermann's critique of the war. These are moments that occurred because people were taking moments frozen out of the flow of mass media and putting attention on it, critically or otherwise, by bringing it, quoting it, and bringing it to YouTube. And one of the functions YouTube plays right now is to allow everyday people to decide what's important in the content of mass media. And that's a form of doing it too, even if the editing consists simply of beginning a clip and ending a clip and sending it out there. It's a way of changing our dynamics in relation to media. And so we have to get out of this mode where we think that the only value created is created by a filmmaker. It's also created by communities mobilizing around pieces of media they've seized that other people made. And that's why the intellectual property battles are so important to understanding the dynamics of the changes that are taking place.
But in relationship to the control of all of this, I just heard yesterday, and you may have, as I said, you may have talked about this earlier, about Turkey turning off YouTube because of attacks on Ataturk. I don't know if you all know about this, but I am curious to hear you speak about the idea that, as one of you just spoke to, the control over the possible distribution of this material still is an issue. And I'm curious where you see the worst possibility of this, Turkey being one, this recent example, and the way it can be avoided, if indeed it can be avoided.
I'll take a jump at that. I think having started this out with what's the best scenario you can think of, I think we're definitely seeing the experiment in China, wherein you've got the equivalent of YouTube, you've got the equivalent of Flickr, whatever it is that people find to be very popular outside of China in terms of using digital media to produce and distribute culture, is reproduced in China. They've got they have their MySpace and their Facebook there, and it's controlled. There are tens of thousands of human censors. There are automatic controls. There is censorship built into the routers looking for particular words. Is it possible that 95% or 99% or close to 100% of the people get most of what they need and most of what they want in terms of having a voice, expressing themselves, just as long as they don't talk about politics? And will that continue to give the benefits of having a very widespread cultural production and yet maintain the authority of central totalitarian control? I think that's that's really the question about that techno-political social experiment that's going on in China. And of course, nobody knows the answer there. Maybe only 1% anywhere really care about politics. That's one possible answer. Another possible answer is that my co-teacher at Berkeley, Xiao Chang, is a human rights activist, Tiananmen era exile, and he's pretty in close touch with what people do in China. And there's a lot of counter-power maneuvering going on with the bloggers there. If your website has been chosen by the censors to be shut down, the word they use is harmonize. And apparently there's a pun on the word crab, I think, in Chinese. And so a lot of bloggers have begun putting pictures of crabs on their blogs to signify that they're not with the program. Is that sufficient? Will they find ways around? Will they continue to always find ways around censorship? When certain words become banned, will they use puns on those words? Or are they being tamed? I think nobody here has the answer to that, but you asked for what the dark vision is. The dark vision is that we would enable a very widespread participation in the production and distribution of culture just as long as it doesn't question the authorities.
Can I make a comment? But I think China is kind of, well, the United States is kind of similar to China in my view, in that it's kind of like the Truman Show, you know, where there's a certain wall and beyond that wall you can't go. China has a wall in one place, America has a wall in another place. I mean, certain things you can't put on the internet in America either, right? It's in fact those places where there is no false sense of security, like Burma, where you've had crisis for over 10 years, 3,000 people are dead, you know, they're throwing monks in jail. There's no myth there that things are going okay, right? And there you've got, you know, apparently the guy who started the whole monk thing, he's on the loose. They haven't caught him, right? He's in his 20s. They would have blocked every single photo of Burma. They're everywhere. You've got photos of everything. You've got videos coming out like crazy, right? So in Burma, where they are not even hiding the fact that they're trying to censor everything, there's tons of media coming out, right? And so I think that, you know, this kind of false sense of security part and us lapsing into this sort of firewalled fishbowl can happen, but I think as soon as, you know, basically the shit comes down, you know, the smart kids are always going to figure out a way to get around this system, and there are lots and lots of people who are working on things like the Tor network for anonymous surfing, and there's lots of tools, and the fight against terror is actually a fight against some of these folks as well, and so we need to be careful so that we don't look at these hackers and think of them as just evil. They're actually the part of the system that creates the immune system and creates the ability for us to go there. But anyway, I'm actually quite confident that the open internet folks can handle anything any government can dish out.
Well, you know, in fact, if you want to find what the latest hack on the Great Firewall is, I don't know what the Chinese equivalent is, but if you just look for the tag GFW, and you'll find what someone has come up with somewhere. So I would rather not be in the position of trying to keep that kind of control from leaking, because anyone who figures out how to get around it can get the word to everyone else instantaneously through that same structure. So, I mean, this power and counterpower is not new, but it's much, much, much more difficult when the leak is located in everybody's pocket.
I'm still a little worried, because as access grows worldwide and technology allows us to place videos easily online worldwide, there still is a problem with creating and actually producing engaging videos, because working with video is very different from working with text. And I'm involved, I write and translate for Global Voices, like Joito says, it's a wonderful way to actually generate voices from around the world. It works really well for text, but it would not work for video. And I mean, perhaps like Yochai was saying, the one reason is because we grow up with text literacy and not really with video. But I wonder what are the next steps that you have to suggest to, so that we don't drown in all this content and we actually produce better content that's more engaging.
A process thing, our comment queue is really long, so if people can do brief comments and we can circulate the mic, that would be great.
Well, I think the essence is education. I mean, I think this is why why I see the issue of new media literacies as absolutely linked to the notion of participatory culture, is that young people or anyone is going to produce media based on the models they have available to them. And right now, most of the models are commercial, and people are struggling to match commercial and technical standards that are difficult for them to match, or they're struggling to find new voices. And I think the ability to pool knowledge by sharing our work with each other, but also to ensure that there's training programs that support not just those kids who are leaning totally behind in the participation gap, who have no access to this, but also those who are part of the new media movement, but who don't necessarily have a language to talk critically about their own practice, or don't necessarily know how to teach themselves how to grow stronger. Some communities are very good at teaching themselves, but others really do need some help through every kind of educational outlet we have in thinking about media literacy in new ways.
But Henry, isn't it also the case that the amateur movement shouldn't try to just replicate the same sense of professionalism of the professional? And the whole point is there may be fundamentally new ways to make really effective media that isn't just mimicking the classical way we think of media.
No, well, my point is that precisely by looking at those models as part of what an educational program should be,
Right,
that in the absence of an educational intervention, it's likely most people will only be exposed to the commercial models and are most likely to try to simply replicate it. Whereas if we expose them to a broader range of stuff, they have other models that think.
And notice we don't really have much of a
practices.
critical theory for the stuff we're talking about.
But there's a hacker model too, right? I mean, like when I had an AMV guy show me his video and step through frame by frame by frame and explain how he did it, I realized that there was a process of mentorship where you have these people who are extremely good at making engaging video. Then there's this whole kind of web of people that connect, and you can do a lot of this online as well.
So literacy education doesn't have to be formal education. It could be informal through any number of channels, including experienced fan vitters teaching newbies how to do what they do. I mean, that's part of an educational intervention. It's only going to be effective if it occurs at every level, from the grassroots to the institutional.
David Harris, Global Lives Project. First, I want to say this is a great panel, and I love the utopianism especially. So I want to maybe make a challenging question on that note. So JSB, are we allowed to call you that, or is that just a personal? Okay.
Yeah.
I loved the point you made about the life of objects and thinking about information in those terms. And as a social scientist, I couldn't help but think back to commodity fetishism, and then also to think of the way that Henri Lefebvre, the French social theorist, repackaged that as the study of space and looking how space is produced. And you made me think a little bit further about sort of information fetishism, or the fetishism of the byte, which would mean not thinking critically about how the byte got in front of my eyes, or how the byte got to me. And I couldn't help but notice as the panel went by that most of your, if not all of your, primary affiliations are with private institutions. And I couldn't help but think about what would be happening if this discussion were happening in Brazil, or which is a place that I'm very familiar with, or in Europe. And in particular, just to finish, what is your utopian vision of the state, and what is your utopian vision of how the state is involved with this revolution?
You know, it's curious you ask, because I was going to ask Howard to, I'll come back to answer your question, but I was going to ask Howard, you opened this panel on the vision. utopian vision, but then what's the scenario to get there? And I was going to suggest it'd be very interesting to throw this back to the one person in this entire room that has thought more about this than ever is Mimi. And she kind of laid out kind of a vision, but it'd be very interesting to have you back on stage again talking about how you got, how do you see getting there, the scenario to get there, and so on and so forth. Because I think that my answer to you, my gloss on an answer to you is I really think we're going to find a way to reposition the role of the amateur. I think we're going to see the role of the amateur in all kinds of dimensions, and not just in the kind of DIY, DIT type movements or whatever, but I think that we have underestimated what that power is in the doing of science, the creation of technology, the creation of literacy and all this. And it really gets back again to bringing to the fore a new form of motivation, because basically what underlies this is intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic motivation. And yet almost all the theories of government, all the theories of economics, all the theories that drive our institutions, to a large extent, has to do with understanding incentive structures for kind of extrinsic motivation. And yet what we're really finding here, I mean, everyone in this room is being driven by quite different types of incentive systems, basically intrinsic motivation. And how do we get these things to play out? Because they're going to play out often outside of any of the kind of formal institutions that we know about. And in Europe, there's a big movement towards what's called ambient education, which is for the first time recognizing that most learning, even formal learning, happens outside the classroom, and kind of a focus on the ambient notion and the ambient nature of learning, which is very close to the ambient nature of creation that comes back to the amateur movement.
I'm sorry. Last weekend I was at a conference of economists, political scientists, historians on the future of thinking on government and markets, trying to answer that question. And it's very much along the lines that John was suggesting, which is if you just look at an arc of 100, 150 years of rationalization of the state, in Europe, let's say it starts from Bismarck and goes to companies. Here it starts from companies and goes to administration. But you get the first 2/3 of the 20th century, very much, the entire 20th century is around the sense of trying to control system and trying to motivate them and control them. And the first 2/3 are rationalization through well-ordered structures. And the second and the last third is about thinning down human beings to a utility curve, and then giving them pokes with incentives called prices. And government then adopts that in the notion of market mechanisms or price mechanisms for regulation from spectrum to emissions. And I think what you're seeing now at the moment, still very much in the basic science level, on one end, and the cultural practice that we are all talking about at another level, an understanding that actually people aren't either shirkers who need to be controlled or automatons who need to be behaviorally price adjusted, but are these complex people, sometimes selfish, sometimes collaborative, sensitive to the social dynamic in which they're in, and that you can build that, and this is the next critical point that I think needs work, you can build that in interfaces with existing systems. You see it more today in, as we spoke about earlier with regard to the market, in businesses beginning to try to think of how it is that they interface, and a lot less with government. But I think that's the next phase of thinking about the structure of the state and its relationship to society, is moving away from bureaucracy can only be replaced by market, to how you build interfaces with social dynamics of people who are motivated to some extent, capable and don't need everything done for them, but at the same time also capable of contributing and doing things together with a much lighter and more permeable relationship. Now that I think is one of the interesting progressive agendas. Progressive I do mean now in the early 20th century sense, not in the I don't want to call myself a liberal sense. That is one of the most interesting progressive projects in statecraft and institutional design that we face.
And perhaps the most ironic part of this to me Some of you know I've been studying institutional structures, not in this country, but in China. And China is so much closer to understanding loosely coupled industrial systems than we have. That these systems are amazingly open in ways that we can't even begin to think about in terms of the institutional structures there. So I think we're going to see, new prototypes coming on that will be very, very interesting. You want to talk about the environmental movement as an example?
No.
Okay.
Can I just make one quick comment? I've been clear in other forums, but just to be clear here, I won't speak on behalf of America, but I'm Japanese, and I'm very clear that one of the main reasons I'm doing all of this is to overthrow the Japanese government. I mean, it has to happen. We're all working on it, and it's even the people who work in government know that it needs to be overthrown. I mean, it's never been overthrown, really. I mean, so there's never been a popular revolution in Japan, and that's one of the broken things, and it all ties back to that for a lot of the Japanese.
Well, you should let me know whether you want me to put that on the internet.
You can. I put it in the New York Times the other day.
Well, the internet.
I just want to speak very briefly to that question in regard to the fact that when we talk about the state, we're really thinking, I think, a set of assumptions, not just Americans, that are based loosely on a narrative about how humans do things and why we do things. And it's still largely a Hobbesian narrative in which we're at war and humans are primarily self-interested. I went on about this at some length. Jonathan Aronson was generous enough to bring me to the Annenberg Center to talk about this, but I believe, and I know that Professor Benkler is working on this, that we are beginning to understand something about the dynamics of human cooperation and collective action beyond that old story. And when a new story emerges, well, you might regard it as utopian, but it's not that humans are suddenly going to become other than what we are. It's that we're going to be able to rearrange the architecture of our institutions to take a lot of advantage of our ability to communicate with each other. If IBM could embrace open source and open source billions of dollars worth of its software and put thousands of its patents into an innovation commons, I think it's entirely possible that we will see forms of governance emerge based on ways in which individuals acting in their self-interest can do things such as we've seen on the internet that add up to a lot more for everyone, that we can create public goods, that people will, I think close to $1 billion was contributed by people after the Asian tsunami outside of states. People are beginning to do things for one another, maybe in ways that we haven't before. Maybe it's not that people are not altruistic. Maybe people will be altruistic if it's easy enough to do. Or maybe, as we've seen with some of the arrangements that people have made around the world with the way they share water, that if you simply distribute the policing of the arrangement, instead of having the state and the law and the regulation do it, have you and your neighbors do it. There are, I think, lots and lots of pieces of evidence. We've got one more question over here. Okay, we've got about 15 more minutes just to give us all a time check on this.
All right. I would love to hear your thoughts on what kind of things will make a video viral. So this kind of relates to this gentleman's question on, what can we do to make better content? And you guys commented on media literacy education, but I'm sure we can all think of 10 videos out there on YouTube that just it's really viral, it's really popular, and all of those have really low budgets. So what do you guys think are the main ingredients that makes a video viral? And maybe not just like the content, but also is it to reach out a bunch of power users on Dig or submitting links on blogs?
All right, well, I want to begin by stating how frustrated I am with the term viral itself as a model for thinking about what's going on. And if there's a word I dislike even more than viral, it's the word meme. Both of which, to my mind, take away all the human agency out of what's going on. So I've been moving toward talking about spreadability which sort of recognize that there's something that's spreadable, has properties that enable it to be spreadable. It has affordances, but it also counts on other people with agency to actively choose to spread that content from one space to another. That viral keeps us in a metaphor of infection. If we're exposed to something enough, it will infect us and we will act against our will to circulate it. So the first place to start, and the spreadability, I think, actually gives us a way to then think about, all right, what's the agenda of those people who are spreading my content? Rather than thinking of the property of the design, what is it that I'm providing to these people that makes them, that gives them a motive to want to circulate my content more further than I already have? What's the stakes for that? And usually, from video to circulate far and wide, it's either got to find common ground with large numbers of people, or it's got to provide multiple motives for different niche and subcultural communities to participate in its circulation. And so you got to think about it in that term. And then what do I have to do to enable people to easily circulate the video? You know, and that's where your things like Dig and sort of making it, creating spaces where people have access to it, putting in forms that are easily moved from one place to the other become part of it. But again, I think we think of these questions differently if we start from a metaphor that doesn't assume passivity and infection, but starts from the assumption that there's agency and action that takes place when stuff circulates. Which just goes back to what I said, that circulating things, archiving things, curating things is an act of doing and not simply something that's done to you. And I think that we've got to value those activities as a central part of what allows this media economy to work. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that, but.
All right, I have a quick question here on safety, on self-protection. Last week, a few friends of mine who are video bloggers, they go to Chad a couple times a year to go to refugee camps and basically tell the story of the refugees. They were in the capital of Chad when rebels came in and tried to take the city, and they were caught for 3 days under fire. And they just kept blogging. And what was amazing was their videos went on the web, and they were getting about 1,000 hits a day during the refugee camp. As soon as BBC picked it up and they realized that they became the news, the hits went way through the roof. My question is for you, to all of us who are trailblazers, who are producers, who may be arrested at some point or may be beaten at some point for what we do, how do we better protect ourselves and how do we better protect each other?
Well, there are a lot of organizations that, like Global Voices, we spend a lot of time getting our editors out of jail. We spend a lot of time educating people on how not to get caught. Then there are also organizations that help protect against lawyers who come and try to, do things to you. And I think that the key is that there's a network, and you have to be kind of, if you're in communication, if you're by yourself, it's really difficult. I think the whole point, though, is that there's a whole network of networks of people who help each other in these times of crisis. And I've seen numerous times where people have been kidnapped, people are in jail, and there's just so many activists now that collectively move. And the interesting thing is that we have a lot of insiders in industry and government who actually help out as well. So when we're trying to get somebody in China, for instance, we have the whole community. And I can't tell you all the detail of what you do because that actually is also a risk to the people who help. But I think the key is to plug into the network somewhere. But the good thing is because of the internet, just a very short side anecdote, I was talking to somebody from the UN and they said that the personal landmine treaty would not have happened before the internet because the NGOs were so able to coordinate and they ran circles around the government guys because they were so much better coordinated. The NGOs and the resistance are much better at using the net than those people who come and crack down. I know a Chinese guy who was asked by the police, do you know this person? It was a English language transliteration of his name, and they couldn't figure out that was him. And so while they're very scary and they're huge in number, they're not nearly as sophisticated as we are. And so I think it's you have to be careful, but there's a lot of help.
Mark Davis, Yahoo. I want to ask you guys about the future, which I know is part of the topic of the panel. And especially on very large scales of participation. So we've talked about communities that we need to court that pre-exist, the ability to create kind of ad hoc connections to other people, but really the future where there's literally billions of people producing media in real time, situated in time and space around the planet. So, 5 to 10 years out. How do you think, and I don't think we have even the intellectual frameworks yet to understand what that world would be like, how social organization would work, what media would be like, the formats that would be there. So I guess I'm asking you to go further out, and I'd like to understand your vision of a world in which there are literally billions of daily media producers in the world sharing content, and where we know where and when that content's actually come from, and how you think that might change society, and change media, the forms that media that people actually create and share. So it's a scale question.
What started to say?
I think you have to think from the closest analogy we have, which is text. That is to say, we have 1 billion people. We have some number in the 9 figures writing. And I think we have basic structures of organization. I mean, one of the things that doesn't scale is human attention on an individual level. And so one of the things that you see are the creation of these 2 competing phenomena. One, highly visible sites at the top end of the distribution. And the other is clustering around some core of a network, be it a social dynamic, be it a topical dynamic. And that particular question of scale, unless you're talking about the technical complexity of processing, which is not what I thought you were asking.
No, I'm not.
You're talking about the human capacity to comprehend the world.
Yes.
Then I think that it's not fundamentally different from what we have today, but with a much richer set of media. And I just have to think about what it is that would overlay over these basic social structures and topical structures and large-scale distributions with clustering that would be different because of the particular form of visualization.
So my take on that is ironic. I mean, in some sense, this is a return on attention problem, an ROA problem, okay? And I think when we get to the state that you're really talking about, we're going to invent a radical new idea. There's going to be an information Sabbath. We're going to recognize the need to pull back 1 day a week and disconnect. So we actually have a little bit of time to reflect and marinate in our own reflections.
So Lev Manovich has been talking for some time about databases as a metaphor for understanding, not just a metaphor, but a practical issue in terms of thinking about media design. I think in the world you're describing, the database-based video becomes really important. So after one of the debates, Joe Biden had said that Rudolph Giuliani had every sentence had 3 words, a noun, a verb, and 9/11. And someone on the web had taken, and Giuliani denied it, slapped Biden down for the comment. Someone on the web had taken and just collected all of the statements of Giuliani saying 9/11 again and again and again. For 5 minutes, you hear one sentence with 9/11 and after another. That's the power of a database. Now, you imagine that, in a sense, a database so big we can't even watch it all. Whereas people pool their experience and create works that speak to that speak numerically, in effect, about what their lives are like, that people speak and testify through the collective intelligence management of images, then I think the database does become a powerful media form that we'll want to be thinking about in the future that you're describing.
So Mimi said something very smart about how when we have these economic shifts that are letting people do all these things, we're going to have to develop new sets of social norms that go along with that. And I'm interested in, well, one of the main ways as a society that we can steer those social norms is by creating institutions that let us do that. And in the early days of the technology side of this world, we created a bunch of institutions that, the EFF was so many years ahead of everyone else at thinking about these issues that it was really able to steer things in the right direction. And in IP law, there have been things like Creative Commons, that sort of thing. So I was interested if there were institutions that you saw, more specific institutions rather than how do we talk about the institutions, like what Yochai was saying about, oh, they can be more distributed, or what if Larry Lessig were here, he would say, you can do it through code, but what specific institutions would be useful to making DIY a better place in 10 years from now that people here could form?
I mean, I'm being this is very niche-y, but the video hub that we just launched at Witness, we're going through a really interesting set of problems where anybody can upload a video. It may contain privacy violations. It may be false. It may be really, really important. And so we need the community to get together and say, well, that actually wasn't that protest. Or I was there, that's true. And be much more intelligent than a newsroom could be, because these are coming from anonymous sources. And so what we're doing is we're coming up with editors and a community to really quickly vet and then actually package and produce compelling videos in a bottom-up way. And I think, and also protect a lot of different things. And it's a fairly complex problem, but we're trying to do it in an open way and to create a set of sort of standards and norms around that. And I think, again, it's a niche, but I think if we're successful, and we may not be, if we're successful, I think that could be a model for different kinds of.
Yeah, I would point to the Organization of Transformative Works, which is another movement a number of people here are involved with, which is coming out of fandom and trying to build an infrastructure so fans can circulate their own material without having to go through profit-making enterprises, that it's building a legal support around it from the bottom up, and is building an intellectual and cultural support around it from the bottom up, all of which seems like a model that other kinds of communities involved in DIY media should be looking at. And I think the next step out from that is going to be building organizations that cut across communities so that those groups pool knowledge and collaborate and work together to protect common interest. But the first step may be each community of interest that's involved in the collective use of YouTube beginning to work to define their own space and to promote their own interest.
You know, down at a very concrete level, it's been very interesting to look at how the after-school programs have had a major force in transforming the ways that people in school, teachers, think about what's possible. I think we have to be able to generalize the after-school programs to rethink what's the role of the community library, what are new types of space, community spaces as well, and then how those venues that are located in space move into the virtual world.
My name is Elizabeth Tolman. I'm with the Center for Media Literacy and the Alliance for a Media Literate America. So, John, you took my thunder just a little bit, and I was going to answer his question before I asked mine, and that was that education will be the solution to this, but I want to make sure that this body understands that media education doesn't have all the answers either. I mean, we're growing and developing and defining new kinds of curriculum, not just what we teach, but how we teach, right, which is doing. And so what I often say, the two sides of the media literacy education coin is analysis and practice. You can't do one without the other. And at the same time, there's, even though there's curriculum developed, there's teacher training done, I mean, we are at 2% of what needs to be done. So that will grow in the next 10 years too, driven by this force of what we're doing here this weekend.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add to that, very much that both Ida and I said yesterday, is there is a new emerging epistemology. There are new ways, yes, of knowing, yes, that we have to begin to recognize.
Yes. In fact, there is a book out called The Visual Way of Knowing.
Yeah, as an example.
Yes. My question, however, is, without asking each of you to divulge your own personal politics, what do you think of the current Obama Clinton campaign and the bringing out of people, the fact that we have twice as many voters as ever before? I just wondered if the current excitement about this current campaign is something that we should maybe look at from what we've been talking about.
No, I suggested in some of my remarks yesterday that I think the energies behind the Obama campaign, but also the energies behind the Ron Paul campaign and a number of other efforts in both parties, stems from the do-it-yourself media movement in really powerful ways. I alluded to Justine Cassell's statement that young people, that adult leaders tend to talk about I, and youth leaders online talk about we. The difference between the I campaign based on experience, a la Hillary, and the we campaign based on bottom-up energy, a la Obama, sort of speaks to those different models of thinking about what political change might look like. And I say that with certain bias because I am an Obama boy, but I do, I do think that what he's doing in that campaign is really to sort of empower people to think together. And if we understand the presidency as a collective intelligence, then the issue of experience looks fundamentally different. If you empower everyone to participate and pool their knowledge and work bottom up to bring about change, then the question of whether the leader is about style and about process and about how you govern more than the expertise in the White House being the central way of structuring an administration. And I think that, to my mind, is part of what's at stake, and issue after issue. If you look at the Obama-Clinton discussions, there are two models, and of where we're at. And it's not just we don't want to go back to the 90s. It's we don't want to go back to the centralized mindset, the nanny state, that's sort of represented by a certain way of thinking about administrative power. I don't want a president who feels my pain. I want a president who helps us work together to solve the problem.
So I think we're going to need to start winding down here. I just wanted to say, sort of on this whole issue of alternative organizational forms and institutions, I would really encourage you all to go to the workshop day tomorrow, because really among the group here convened here, there's a tremendous amount of knowledge about how to organize alternative institutions and technologies and organizations. And a lot of the focus of tomorrow is going to be about the hands-on teaching and sharing about these things. Just from my own work with fan communities, there's tremendous knowledge there about how amateur networks, communities work, how they organize, how motivational structures work within those communities, why passionate interests and driven individuals mobilize in these groups and produce amazing work through these community structures. I think there's, we have our activists working in the political domain. Everybody's going to be showing up tomorrow to do much more of the community-based conversation and hands-on stuff. So I would really encourage you to participate in that if you have any questions along those lines. Howard, did you want a last word before?
I just wanted to have a last procedural note here. With all of you who are going to upload video or podcasts or blog about this, if you would tag it with the word video 247, that would probably make it easy for all of us to find it.
And the other, so we're going to take a quick break now because we ran late, but we do want to start the screenings on time at 5 o'clock. And if you're really serious about collective production and tapping the collective intelligence, I really encourage you to stay for the screenings, because these screenings were curated through a collective process of 10 curators working with the conference committee, each tapping their networks and their own communities to pick the very best of what we thought represented DIY video. So I think it's going to be a great evening of showings. And I wanted to thank our panel for being great and flexible and awesome as usual.